They didn't just put her on the auction block. They slapped a $5 tag on her life like she was less than a sack of grain. It was supposed to be just another rainy Tuesday in Dust Hollow, but by noon, the sky had turned the color of gunmetal, and the town square smelled of wet horses and trouble. That's when Marin Locke was dragged up onto the warped wooden platform, her dress clinging from the downpour, hair plastered to her face. Rufus Kane, the man who called himself her stepfather, stood beside her with a grin that made the onlookers shift in discomfort. $5, he barked, voice cutting through the rain. She cooks, she cleans, she keeps her mouth shut. No one moved. No one dared. The rain tapped against rifle barrels and tin roofs, while Marin kept her eyes on the ground, her fist clenched so hard her nails bit into her palms. And then, from the edge of the crowd, boots hit the mud with slow, deliberate steps. A stranger, tall, broad-shouldered, rain streaming off his hat, pushed through the silence. He didn't haggle. He didn't ask questions. He simply dropped a pouch of coins into the mud at Rufus's feet and said, in a voice low enough to make the air tighten, "She's leaving with me." The crowd froze. That was the moment the fight for her life truly began. The coins hit the mud with a dull, wet thud, sinking halfway into the brown water pooled between the warped boards. Rufus Kane stared at them like he couldn't believe anyone would pay that much for a woman he'd been trying to be rid of for years. His lip curled, the kind of half-smile a man wears when he thinks he's won. But Joran Hale didn't give him the satisfaction of a second glance. "Untie her," Joran said flatly. "She ain't tied," Rufus replied, smirking. "Girl knows better than to run." The words were meant as a joke, but they struck like a slap. Marin's shoulders stiffened, yet her eyes never rose from the mud. She had learned long ago that looking a man like Rufus in the eye was an invitation to be hit. Joran stepped forward, closing the gap until Rufus had to tilt his chin up to meet him. For a long beat, rain drummed on their hats, their coats, their boots. Then, with a slow precision that felt more dangerous than any shouted threat, Joran said, "She's not yours anymore." It should have ended there. But Dust Hollow was the kind of place where nothing ever ended clean. From the shadows of the feed store, two men peeled away from the wall, their faces half hidden by soaked bandanas. They moved like wolves circling a wounded deer, cautious but eager. One of them was Brody Miller, a man Marin recognized by the jagged scar across his cheek. He'd once shoved her into the mud for spilling his drink at the saloon, laughing as she scrambled to her feet. "You buying trouble today, Hale?" Brody called over the rain. "'Cause that's what she is." Joran didn't turn his head. "Step aside." Instead, Brody's partner, a thick-set man with a broken nose, swung a boot up onto the platform and leaned in, the boards groaning under his weight. $5 for her. 5 more says you won't make it to the edge of town." Rufus chuckled low, as if the odds had suddenly swung back in his favor. Marin's pulse hammered. She could smell the whiskey on Brody even from 10 feet away, and she knew what came next. Fists, maybe worse. The moment broke in a flash of motion. Brody lunged. Joran caught the man's wrist mid-swing, twisting hard until the bandana slipped from Brody's mouth in a strangled yell. The other man charged up the steps, but Marin, acting on something older than fear, shoved Rufus into him, sending both crashing into the muddy street below. A shout erupted from the onlookers as Joran drove his fist into Brody's jaw. The crack was loud enough to make the nearest horse rear. Brody stumbled back, boots skidding on the slick wood, and fell off the platform into the rain-churned muck. Joran turned to Marin, rain streaming down his face. "Get to my horse." She didn't argue. Her boots slapped against the planks as she leapt down, skirts heavy with water. Behind her, Brody spat blood into the mud and bellowed, "This ain't over, Hale." But it was, at least for now. As Joran swung into the saddle and hauled her up in front of him, the crowd parted without a word. The rain swallowed the square, and the two of them rode out into the open country, leaving Rufus and his men to choke on their own humiliation. The rain didn't ease as they left Dust Hollow behind. It thickened, turning the red dirt road into a ribbon of sucking mud. Marin clung to the saddle horn, her skirts plastered to her legs, the rhythm of the horse's stride thudding up through her bones. Behind them, the town was already shrinking into a blur of gray, but she didn't fool herself. Rufus Kane and his hangers-on weren't the kind to let go quietly. Jorn's jaw was set, eyes flicking to the tree line with a predator's awareness. He'd been in enough border towns to know that men like Brody Miller didn't accept humiliation without repayment. By the time they reached the narrow pass that cut between two ridges of jagged limestone, the sound of hooves came from behind. Faint at first, then pounding, closing the distance. "They're coming," Marin breathed. "I know," Jorn said. His voice was flat but not calm, the kind of controlled edge a man has when he's already thinking 10 moves ahead. He reined the horse to the right, leading it into a shallow gap between boulders. "Down!" She slid off without argument, boots squelching in the mud. Jorn tied the reins to a scrub pine and stepped into the open, his duster hanging heavy with rain. 3 riders burst into view, Brody in front, 2 others she didn't recognize flanking him. All of them had guns drawn. "You should have kept your head down, Hale," Brody snarled, his lips split from the earlier fight. "We could have walked away clean." "You came to a wet auction to buy trouble," Jorn said. "Now you've got it." The first shot cracked the air before Brody could answer. It came from the rider on the left, a close miss, splintering rock beside Jorn's head. He moved instantly, dropping to one knee and firing back. The man's horse reared, screaming, as its rider tumbled into the muck. Brody charged, spurring his mount straight at Jorn, but Jorn pivoted, grabbing the horse's bridle with one hand and driving his other fist up into Brody's ribs. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and in that split second, Marin saw the third rider closing in from the side, a long knife glinting even in the dull rainlight. Something hot surged in her chest. Without thinking, she snatched a broken tree branch from the ground and swung hard, connecting with the man's forearm. The knife clattered to the mud, and Jorn was there in an instant, shoving the attacker back against the rock face. The fight collapsed into chaos. Boots sliding, fists flying, mud spraying with every step. Jorn moved like he'd been here before, a knee into the gut, an elbow across the jaw, a sweep that sent one man face first into the muck. Marin stayed close enough to be useful, but far enough to dodge the wild arcs of the fight. Twice she threw rocks, one catching a shoulder, another striking Brody's temple just enough to stagger him. Finally, Jorn drove the butt of his revolver into Brody's jaw, and the man dropped to his knees, coughing blood into the rain. His 2 companions lay sprawled in the mud, groaning but alive. Jorn kept his revolver trained on them as he backed toward Marin. "Get up," he ordered. His voice carried the weight of someone who meant it for good or ill, depending on the choice they made. The men didn't follow. Maybe it was the mud, maybe it was the look in his eyes. But they stayed where they were as Jorn and Marin mounted up. They rode hard through the pass, rain slashing at their faces. Only when the ridge fell away into open plain did Jorn slow the horse. "You all right?" he asked without looking at her. Marin's hands were raw from gripping the saddle, her breathing ragged. "I hit one of them," she said, almost disbelieving her own voice. "Good," he replied. "Next time, don't hesitate." She looked at him then, rain streaking her cheeks like tears she hadn't let fall. It wasn't gratitude she felt. Not yet. It was something harder, sharper. The realization that for the first time in years, she wasn't entirely powerless. And that, as much as the cold and the wet, made her shiver. The rain finally broke as the plains opened, but the air still smelled of wet iron and churned mud. Jorn kept the pace steady, glancing over his shoulder from time to time. Marin didn't need to ask why. She could feel it too. Brody Miller's type didn't give up after being left in the mud. They bided their time and came back meaner. By late afternoon, the land began to change, rolling hills flattening into open pasture, dotted with wind-bent oaks. On the far rise sat a house of rough-cut timber with a tin roof dull from weather. A long barn stretched to its right, and a split-rail fence ran crooked around the yard. It was no grand homestead, but it had weight, the look of a place that had been fought for and kept. "This is it," Jorn said as they crossed the last creek. Inside, the air was warm from a wood stove. He handed her a blanket and nodded toward a chair by the hearth. "Dry off." Marin sank into the chair, the heat biting at her chilled skin. She watched him move around the room, boots tracking mud across the floor, hat tossed onto a hook, rifle leaned within arm's reach. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but it wasn't safe either. It was the kind of quiet that holds unspoken questions. Night fell fast. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn doors. Jorn stepped out to check the latch, leaving Maren by the fire. She pulled the blanket tighter, staring at the flames until a sound snapped her head up. Faint at first, then sharper. Hooves. More than one horse. She stood, moving to the window. In the distance, just beyond the fence line, dark shapes shifted against the moonlit grass. Her breath caught. Jorn came back in, closing the door without a sound. "They're here," he said, voice low. It wasn't a question. He reached for the rifle, checked the chamber, then slid a revolver across the table toward her. "If they get through the door, you aim center. Don't hesitate." The pounding started minutes later, fists and boots against the barn first, then the porch. A voice she knew all too well cut through the dark. Rufus Kane. "You think you can keep what's mine, Hale? Hand her over, and I'll let you keep your teeth." Maren's stomach twisted, but anger burned hotter than fear. She stepped into the open doorway where Joran stood, his rifle resting easy against his shoulder. "I was never yours," she called out. The yard erupted, 3 riders fanning out, 2 men on foot charging the porch. Joran fired once, the crack splitting the night. One of the men fell, rolling into the dirt. The others scattered for cover. Gunfire answered from the fence line, splintering the wood around the windows. "Down," Joran barked. Maren dropped behind the heavy table as another shot slammed into the doorframe. The air filled with the smell of powder and pine sap from the splintered boards. A shadow moved at the side window, too fast for thought. Maren lifted the revolver, fired once. The figure jerked back, cursing, the sound fading into the night. Her hands trembled, but she kept the barrel steady, her jaw clenched. The fight stretched on in bursts. Gunfire, shouts, the pounding of boots on the porch. Twice they tried the door. Twice Joran drove them back. Maren caught glimpses through the smoke. Rufus in the yard, shouting orders, Brody's scarred face lit by muzzle flashes. Then came the break. A lantern sailed through the air, shattering against the porch rail in a blossom of fire. Flames licked up the post, throwing wild shadows against the siding. "They're trying to smoke us out," Joran said. Before Maren could answer, the back window shattered. A man climbed through, knife in hand. She didn't think, she moved. The chair by the stove became a weapon, swung hard into his ribs. He grunted, doubled over, and Joran was there, the butt of his rifle sending him sprawling into the woodpile. "Barn," Joran said sharply. They bolted through the side door into the cold night air. The barn loomed ahead, its doors swaying open. And inside, a chance. The loft ladder, the hay bales, the narrow windows looking down over the yard. From there, they returned fire, forcing Rufus's men into the open. It didn't last long. Men who came for a quick grab and go didn't sign up for a siege, and Rufus knew it. Within minutes, the riders pulled back, melting into the dark. Only the wounded were left groaning in the dirt. Silence settled in slow, except for the hiss of dying flames on the porch. Joran lowered his rifle. "You all right?" Maren nodded, though her heart still slammed in her chest. She looked out over the yard, the churned earth, the bodies, the embers drifting into the cold air, and felt something shift. They had come to take her back. They had failed. And for the first time in years, the fear that had shadowed her life was matched by something else entirely. The knowledge that if they came again, she would meet them in the yard, gun in hand, and finish what had been started. Morning came with a sky as pale as old bone, the light spilling over a yard scarred with hoofprints and blood-dark patches in the dirt. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the porch, mixing with the acrid tang of charred wood where the lantern had burned the rail. Joran stood on the steps, coffee untouched in his hand, scanning the empty pasture like the fight might flare up again at any second. Maren moved quietly behind him, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She had not slept. Every creak of the house had pulled her eyes open. But the fatigue was laced with something sharper than fear. It was anger now, burning slow and steady. Last night hadn't been a one-time act of desperation. It had been a message. Rufus Kane wanted her back. and he'd keep coming until he was stopped. By mid-morning, the message shifted. A rider approached from the South Trail, carrying no weapon in his hands, but a folded paper sealed with the red stamp of the county. Joran met him halfway down the yard, scanning the letter while the man muttered, "Sheriff says you're to come into town. Claims have been made." Joran's jaw worked as he read. The charges were laid out plain enough: theft of property and assault with deadly force. Rufus Kane's handwriting sat at the bottom, slick as a snake's tongue. Marin stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, watching Joran fold the paper without ceremony. "They're calling me property now," she said, her voice low. "They're calling you whatever lets them win," Joran replied. "Paper or no paper, that doesn't make it true." But the truth didn't matter in a place like Dust Hollow, not if Rufus had the sheriff's ear. By the time they reached town, whispers had already woven through the streets. Women leaned in doorways, men paused mid-step on the boardwalks, eyes following them like they were a storm rolling down Main Street. The sheriff's office smelled of stale tobacco and damp wool. Sheriff Cutter leaned back in his chair, boots on the desk, a badge dulled by neglect. "Kane's claim says you paid for her at auction, Hale. That makes her a purchase in the eyes of the law." "I paid to shut him up," Joran said evenly. "She walked out because she wanted to. That's not purchase, that's choice." Cutter's gaze slid to Marin. "That true?" Her mouth was dry, but she forced the words out. "I'm not his. I was never his." The sheriff shrugged, as though her word weighed nothing against a man's ink on paper. "Well, that'll be for a judge to decide. Kane's filed for a hearing in 3 days. Till then, you'd be smart to keep to your land and not stir more dust." Outside, the cold air hit sharper than before. Marin felt the stares on her back all the way to the horses. "They believe him," she said. "They don't have to," Joran answered. "We just have to make sure the ones that matter can't touch you." But it wasn't just legal ink and courthouse walls they were up against. That night, as wind rattled the shutters, a small rock clattered against the front door. Joran opened it to find a strip of torn fabric, one of Marin's old dresses from Rufus's place, knotted around a splintered chicken bone. A warning. A promise. The next day, they found tracks near the barn that didn't belong to their horses, and the carcass of a calf left gutted by the fence line. Whoever had done it wanted them rattled. Marin's hands shook when she saw it, but Joran's stayed steady as he dragged the body away. "They're pushing us to act first," he said. "If we do, they'll call it proof we're the problem." The pressure grew heavier when the townsfolk stopped speaking to them altogether. The blacksmith, once cordial with Joran, wouldn't meet his eyes. The woman who ran the mercantile quietly doubled the price of flour. It was an invisible siege meant to starve them out without firing a shot. But the weight didn't break Marin the way it once would have. It hardened her. At night, she sat at the table with a lantern and ink, sketching the faces of Brody, Rufus, and every man who had stood in their yard. She tacked the drawings inside the pantry door. "If they come again," she told Joran, "I want to know every face I'm aiming at." On the second night, a lone rider appeared on the ridge at dusk, silhouetted against the blood-orange sky. He didn't approach, just sat his horse until the dark swallowed him. Marin watched from the porch, the rifle heavy in her hands, and didn't blink until he was gone. By the morning of the hearing, it was clear Rufus's campaign wasn't just about dragging her back, it was about breaking them both before the law had its say. The barn doors were daubed with crude words in red paint. A chicken coop was smashed to splinters. And tucked under the porch rail was a spent shell casing, polished bright, placed where they couldn't miss it. Joran turned it over in his palm, then met her eyes. "They think fear will do the work for them." "They're wrong," Marin said. Her voice was steel now, the kind that didn't bend even under the heaviest weight. 3 days had felt like a countdown to something inevitable, and as the sun climbed on that final morning, they rode back toward Dust Hollow together. Whatever waited in the courthouse, law, lies, or the kind of justice you make with your own hands, neither of them planned to walk away empty. The courthouse in Dust Hollow was nothing more than a 2-room brick box with a leaky roof and a flagpole that leaned like it had given up on standing straight. By the time Joran and Marin arrived, the street outside was lined with wagons and townsfolk, the air thick with the smell of dust and anticipation. Every face they passed was turned toward them, measuring, judging. Inside, the hearing room was cramped, the benches packed shoulder to shoulder. Rufus Kane sat at the plaintiff's table, freshly shaved, wearing a black coat that tried and failed to hide the smug curve of his mouth. Brody Miller leaned against the back wall, one hand resting near his holster, eyes locked on Marin with the kind of grin that promised trouble after dark. The judge, an aging man named Phelps with deep lines around his mouth, called for order. "Mr. Kane, you claim this woman as property purchased by Mr. Hale?" Rufus stood, voice slick. "Not purchased, Your Honor. Stolen. She was in my household under my care when Hale took her." Marin's hands curled into fists under the table. Care. That was his word for the years of scraps, locked doors, and bruises. Jorn's turn came, his voice steady but sharp enough to cut. "I paid Kane to stop the auction. She walked away because she wanted to. I owe him nothing, and she owes him less." A murmur rippled through the room. Phelps turned to Marin. "Do you have anything to add?" She rose slowly, every eye in the room on her. "I was never his property. You can't steal what no one owns. And if this court sends me back to him, it might as well put a rope around my neck." Before Phelps could respond, the back door banged open. Two men burst in, one of them the rider who'd been watching the ranch from the ridge. Brody's hand went for his gun. Joran moved faster. The crack of the shot rang through the room, sending papers flying and people ducking. Chairs toppled, boots scraped the floor, and the courthouse dissolved into chaos. In the smoke and shouting, Joran pulled Marin toward the side exit, shoving past the stunned bailiff. Rufus's voice roared somewhere behind them, calling for them to be stopped, but it was swallowed by the din. Out in the sunlight, they mounted up in one motion. The street split around them, some staring in shock, others stepping back in quiet understanding. As they rode hard out of town, Marin didn't look back. Whatever law Dust Hollow claimed to have, it wasn't built for people like her. But with Joran's hand steady on the reins and the horizon wide before them, she knew one thing with certainty. Rufus Kane would have to kill her to take her back, and she planned to make that the hardest job he'd ever try. This story's lesson is that freedom is never given. It's taken, defended, and paid for in grit. Marin's journey shows that walking away from abuse isn't the end. It's the start of building a life where your worth isn't measured by someone else's price tag. It reminds us that standing beside the right person can mean the difference between being hunted and being safe. But the fight for dignity is always our own. In the end, survival is not just breathing. It's claiming space, refusing to be silenced, and daring to live without asking permission.